really getting used to that thing. Welcome back. Gee, you returned. I love working with diehards. Thank you very much for coming. 7 minutes ago, the Amazon cloud went down and has affected a whole bunch of properties in the eastern coast, including Fast Company magazine and Airbnb and a number of other important companies that are relying on the cloud. Kind of raises, just was perfect timing actually, and we arranged for the cloud to crash to set up this particular session. But if you think about what's happening today with the internet, in some ways it's becoming a computational platform. The first web was based on HTML, and it was about the presentation of content. That's why people talked about websites, eyeballs, stickiness, clicks, page views. The internet was a platform for presentation. Now the internet is based on XML, this new lingua franca for distributed computing, SOAP, UDDI, now HTML5, and so on. And we have the rise of the cloud. And in a sense, humanity is building a computer. And every time you use the internet, whether you upload a photo on a Pinterest or do a Google search or do a mashup, you're programming this global computer. Thomas Watson was famously to have said back in the late 1940s, the world will only need 5 computers. Now, I can't find evidence he said that, but if he did, he was pretty close. You got the Amazon computer, and you got the Google computer, and you've got the IBM computer, and so on. So this is pretty exciting stuff, though, if it's true. We have this global computer. Maybe we could move IT onto this computer, and in doing so, save a whole bunch of costs, get better integration. The best thing is the world would become our IT development shop. So there are huge promises and opportunities, but there are also some dangers. And that is the topic of our panel today. It's an amazing group of people. And to start us off is the chair of the panel, Mike Wolfe, who's the Senior Vice President and CIO of AMD. And he's building out a big global infrastructure to support the business processes at AMD. So please welcome, and he'll introduce the rest of the panel. Welcome, Mike Wolfe.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you and welcome. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen to us today. We're going to talk about what I think is a very fast-moving topic. It evolves all the time. In fact, we were just having a discussion backstage about the definition of the cloud and what it's been and what it's going to be. But as the cloud grows in importance, one of the things that all of us are facing is a series of interesting challenges, everything from public policy implications to data portability to security and many other topics. And so those are some of the things we want to explore today. And we have to sort of navigate this minefield of an emerging technology while we're trying to get all the benefits of the cloud, the scalability, the cost, the reduction of capital, and many other things. Now, joining with me today is a very distinguished panel. Starting on my right, Margaret Stuart, Vice President of Strategy for SAP Americas. And next to her, the SoftChoice Corporate CEO, David MacDonald.
You're right about that.
And then Mark Clifton, Director of Dell's Global Cloud Solutions Business. Albert Chen, the Senior Vice President and Co-CTO of Inventec Corporation. And finally, the President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Western Ontario, Dr. Amit Chakma. So thank you all for joining with me. I really appreciate you being here. The goal of this panel today is to talk about the cloud, convergence, and creativity from a number of aspects. It seems like every few years the IT industry undergoes a tremendous upheaval. If you think about the invention of the personal computer as an example, it fundamentally changed the IT industry. My personal belief is that we're at another one of those inflection points. We're at a convergence of trends for technology, for socialism, social networking, not socialism, social networking. And there are a lot of things that we do today that we've come to use, like photo sharing and so forth, that we think about. But the cloud can be much, much more than that. And we want to talk about things like education, scientific research, healthcare, and even more. You may not know this because it's a pretty well-kept secret, or at least it was. We've started talking about it more, but AMD actually runs a very large private cloud, and we've done so for a while. We run about 123,000 Opteron cores that are the basis of our engineering computing. It's how we generate each generation of microprocessor as they come out. And one of the things that we've been able to see are the real tangible benefits of a working cloud. We actually are able to adjust our capacity and take our projects, in some cases, from months down to weeks, and in some cases, when they get in trouble, give them the extra computing power they need to get back on track. These are benefits that we have never been able to do before, and so we've seen the real benefits of the cloud. But that's just the beginning. And so what we want to do is we want to talk about other models, disruptive cloud models that are driving new businesses, concepts like capacity on demand, where there are a variety of workloads taking place simultaneously, not necessarily on your premise, not necessarily with any input from you. According to Gartner, by the end of 2016, more than 50% of the Global 1000 will have stored sensitive corporate or personal data in a public cloud. And so if we believe that, we have a lot of things to overcome in a very short period of time. And let's not forget that the cloud now means, especially with the advent of consumerism, that people expect their data to be available anywhere on any device at any time. And so how do we make that happen while we keep it secure? And I guess another topic that's of interest lately is the New York Times has published a series of articles questioning essentially the environmental impact of a digital economy and these mega data centers that are going in. While we don't want to pass judgment on those topics, it is an interesting question. Just about any process or service you can think about is moving to the cloud today. And with that significant shift in our cultural and corporate behaviors, it is an interesting topic that we should address. And so those are the kinds of topics that we hope to get to today. And so with that, I'd like to go ahead and get started. And actually, I'd like to start with Dr. Chakma. And I'd like to ask you, most significant users of technology understand what it means to put software and other IT resources in the cloud. But as I mentioned earlier, the cloud really is sort of an ambiguous term. So what do you think epitomizes cloud computing today?
Well, Mark, I couldn't help but to observe that coming from Texas to Montreal, I think you might be forgiven in thinking that socialism is alive and well. In terms of my thoughts on cloud computing, I'm not an expert on the subject matter. I simply represent the viewpoint, if you will, of the users community. So, of course, several things come to mind. First and foremost, of course, the abstract nature of cloud computing. You have access to storage, you have access to devices in many ways, you have access to significant, if you will, resources, software and whatnot, and data, and yet you don't really have to worry about where those are located. Right. I think it requires almost a change in our thought process, because those of us who are kind of used to having those devices at our fingertips now all of a sudden have to realize that actually you don't need them anymore. Looking at it from a utility point of view, when I reflect on it, although the term cloud computing is fairly recent and, of course, very popular nowadays, we have been doing it for many different applications for many, many years. So one very important project that has benefited certainly universities and colleges in this country is called a site licensing project. So where essentially universities and colleges came together with some funding from our federal government and essentially licensed electronic publication database from a number of vendors. So in many ways, that's an excellent example of what cloud computing can do. So now, whether you are in one of our largest universities with the resources that it entails, or you are in our smallest colleges, whether you're a professor or a student, through this mechanism, you have actually access to all that wonderful resources that we have. So, change of mindset, and the power of what cloud computing can do is just enormous.
Thank you. And Margaret, from your perspective, what gets you excited about the cloud? What's on the horizon?
Well, I think accessibility is one thing that's pretty amazing, and I think the cloud is certainly offering us that. But what's equally exciting for me is the simplification that it brings to lives, simplification to personal lives, and simplifications to organizations. So two thoughts on that. I mean, as we live in a world now where there's actually more mobile devices than there are toothbrushes, that's a pretty interesting phenomenon. We'll put the whole discussion of personal hygiene aside for a moment and think about the accessibility and the simplification. So as I look at what SAP is doing, for example, in rural South Africa, that's pretty dramatic. Many in rural South Africa don't have access to a branch banking network, but they do have access to mobile devices. So now we're able to make personal banking and economic progress available to many who never had access to it before because of the combination of mobile and cloud. So that's pretty dramatic, and I find that particularly exciting. From a personal perspective, the whole convergence of the world of mobile and big data and cloud has an interesting personal dynamic. So I've got a busy professional life. I'm also the mother of a pretty busy 6-year-old. So when I make my life accessible digitally, it offers some interesting simplification potentials. So when I get up in the morning, open my mobile device, figure out what's on the schedule for today, well, it's also known that Galen has a field trip next Thursday, and it's going to rain, and that information is accessible. And if you put that together with the precision retailing application from SAP in the cloud, well, then I can be presented over breakfast with 3 potentials to buy a raincoat. Simplifies my life. I don't have to go to a bricks and mortar store. And so that's what excites me. It's the personal connection while also delivering nice profitability potential to the organizations that the cloud now offers.
That is really interesting. But all of this software has to run somewhere. So, Albert, from a device manufacturer's perspective, what are the implications of the cloud on the computing side?
Okay. First of all, thank you. A group of people from Taiwan. We flew half of the world here, and now it's dizzy now. It's in the middle of night. Okay. Now talking about the devices, I guess that's back to Inventec has been in the hardware business, but in recent we do also go into software area. And if you look at from PC from the 1980, let's look at all the devices happened previously. 1980, I remember when I was in college, I still get a piece of paper to punch to go to mainframe, and I'm waiting on the line. So a piece of paper, punch card to do the computer work. And then later, PC, 286, 386, it happens. So the PC world, it became quite popular. Everyone has one PC. Then down the road, if you look at the smartphone comes along, and from feature phone, from smartphone, from iPhone, old phone, everything. So equipped with a lot of power, computing power inside. Until now, cloud computing comes along, and people say it's a supercomputer on the go, and it's many to many. Therefore, from that scenario, I can see the devices. It happens in this ecosystem. I call it ecosystems because sometimes you have devices, you have channel, you have communication channels, you have mobile. Mobility comes from maybe Wi-Fi or even LTE in the future. So for this pipe, you have small pipe, you have big pipe, you have dumb pipe, you have smart pipe. So it becomes a different device that need to fit into the pictures. So in short, I guess the smart devices, we categorize 2 things. One is thin client. I talked with Mark because they have just acquired a company called Wise. they did thin client, and which we did OEM for them. And it's quite popular in recent. And reason is the device combined with three parts. One is so-called computing, and storage, and switching. All the devices need to think of along this line. So one is thin client, another fat client. And fat client and thin client, and how do you distinguish these two? And thin client, as time moves on, you can see IoT, Internet of Things. Machine to machine, 50 billion of sensors everywhere. So I will say when device becomes simple, it becomes sensor, just where everywhere in your clothes or your car, and sends all the data back to the cloud. So what we are thinking, like in this ecosystem, in our device, what we can do. Definitely, fat client is typical iPhone, for example, right? You can have serial. You use your DSP power to implement in your phone, and the phone become quad-core in a 28 nanometer type of processors. iPhone 5, the size become bigger. The consume more power. Is not small. They want you to be cheaper, and it put a pressure on us. And therefore, for the fat client, not only you need to have computer power, you need to have storage, you need to have switching power, core application processor inside. So a fat cloud can really give you a lot of applications to move up. So thin client and fat client, or even sensors, become what we are thinking along the line. How do we invent a smart devices in the futures? Then I guess finally there's a server. I guess we did one sort of a server worldwide. Server is type of maybe for data centers, and previously I believe virtualizations now it become very important. Till maybe a few years back, 2-to-1 ratio of virtualization versus hardware growth. So VM, it becomes a cloud computing very important piece of puzzle there. And therefore our infrastructures, we do IaaS, infrastructure as a service. However, our focus become a power management and automations, load balancing. All these features become, I guess, a very important segments for us as a device manufacturer to move forward. So yes, cloud computing gives us a lot of excitement because no longer iPhone is dominant because thin client will happen, right? So cloud computing give a lot of service applications not only in our country but also in our device side. Yeah, we are trying to innovate in between and see what devices will move on and what's in there, what's required.
Thank you, Albert. So there's a lot of technology that you all have talked about in the hardware and the software. Mark, listening to all those comments, what is the role that the government policy plays, in the standards, interoperability, and maybe most importantly, competition when it comes to the cloud? What do you think?
It's an interesting question because we tend to think of it almost secondarily. We let the technology drive these conversations. But as we look at cloud throughout the world, I think the role of the government's probably as big as with any other technology we've seen in a long time. I think on one hand, the government has to play a role of trying to set some standards to secure the data, to ensure that there's equal access to it. But I think that you can also go too far, and if each individual country sets up different standards and takes it to the point where you can't have an easy way to make that one process fit across multiple countries, you actually run the risk of making that market less attractive as people look to roll out that technology. So I think it's a fine line. And I think we have to work together as from the technology industry and as the providers of the cloud with the governments to try to figure out what can really ensure the safety and the access to of the data while not compromising the market itself. and making it too hard to get to. I mean, I think we look at the European Union and some of the things that are going on there as a good model for access. We recently stood up a data center for cloud out of the UK, and we had to do a lot of due diligence to make sure that different companies across Europe were going to be able to access and store their data there, or whether there were laws that were going to preclude them from doing that based off of some of the compliances and some of the other things. So it's not an easy task. It's still an evolving area of cloud, but I think there's a lot of desire, a lot of will on both sides to partner up and try to figure out what makes the most sense as we go forward with the policies.
Thanks, I appreciate it. So what's interesting to me is we have a lot of large companies represented here, et cetera, and I've heard the term digital divide over the years applied to individuals. But David, does the digital divide also get applied to maybe businesses or institutions in the same way it used to get applied to individuals?
I think that's a great question, and I would say one of the most exciting thing about cloud computing is heretofore, going forward, I think that we can say the digital divide can be eliminated by the cloud. And I think we think about the business applications. We think about how do you create productivity in a business, in a country, and we think about the addressable market. And we think, previously companies would have to spend years installing ERP, and now they can absolutely automate a key business process within almost days. And I think that when you think about the application of technology and the investment required previously by companies, it really did create the digital divide from a business perspective. And there's no question. I mean, we all know companies like Walmart can change the retail geography in a municipality when they move in. We know that, for instance, New York City and places in New Jersey have been fighting Walmart for coming in for years. Why? Because the power of their supply chain puts all those other companies literally out of business overnight. Now those little companies can automate processes in a way which allows them to compete and appear and have the scale of large companies. And I do think it'll give bigger companies the ability to be nimble. When you look at products like success factors, you look at applications where people want to bring in something specifically in a large company, I think you're going to see a lot of automation in areas that would not have been possible before in companies, even though they're large. And so I think, going back to your question, this really is a game changer. And we think this will change significantly the productivity of many, many businesses. And I'll give you a great example. I was on a business trip last week down in the great state of Texas. And I visited an auto body chain head office. And they're implementing a technology where the body shop foreman comes out and scans the VIN with a tablet of the car and automatically goes up to the cloud and gets all the parts and everything for that car specifically onto the tablet, and he just ticks off the parts that needs to be replaced. And that estimate is finished in 15 minutes, and the customer's walking out the door with a piece of paper. And by the way, it's already been approved through the cloud by the insurance company. And, so you just think that would never be possible before. How would you keep up to date that database of all those parts of that car when we know there's, the permutations and combinations of automobiles in this world is, millions. But because of the cloud, they have access to this data, and because of the scanning technology on the tablet and, simple dock, away they go. So I think that's an example of you would think of an auto body shop as a pretty arcane business. True. But now they have the productivity of cloud. They probably can improve the productivity of that process by 80%.
That's amazing. And if you think about one of the models I talk to my team about all the time is, who would have thought a few years ago you could make a software business on software that costs $2 a shot to sell, right? But people are doing that. So it's really changing the business models. But if we look at the traditional sort of multinational, large cap type of companies, Mark, what do you see as the real business benefits from the cloud? What are people actually seeing?
Well, it goes back to the definition of cloud, right? I mean, I think Albert Einstein once said, if you can't explain it to your mother, you probably don't really understand it. And, as everybody sort of referenced earlier, the definition of cloud is a little, pardon the pun, cloudy, but The larger companies, I think the starting point we're seeing with them is really twofold. And I think you have to take a step back and say, well, what's the cloud addressing? And there's really been two avenues to the cloud. The original public cloud tended to favor end users and developers, and it really went to get almost circumventing IT, quite honestly. It went around IT in many, many cases, and IT was not really aware of everything at times. There's probably still lots of data from corporations stored on public cloud entities that IT is just not aware of, or universities may not aware. They may not even care, but certainly the corporations do. And there's a natural evolution that's starting to take place now, where IT is realizing that they might not have had all the tools to address that. And so that's starting to take place, where they're looking at how do I bring those tools in-house and give my own users the speed that they need to get to their data, to their to the tools they need. I think the other piece that's really an inflection point here is software as a service is taking off. We're seeing a lot of best-in-class service only available as a service. So this is something that IT doesn't run, but allows IT to take advantage of that tool. And we're starting to see lots of the big companies adopt that very quickly. And that's starting to change the games as well. In fact, you look now at how do you integrate that back with the tools and the systems that IT and the company have been running for a long time. And we're starting to see people spend more time trying to integrate their data than they were originally developing the software to write that. So integration is going to be another big challenge, and it's probably something on the forefront here. Certainly something that's been on our mind at Dell. We went out and have put a lot of effort around integration software. We purchased a little company called Boomi that's really been fantastic to try to start addressing that for us. And we see that as a really big uptake. But I think the third element from within the big companies is they're driving private cloud. And so you have to say, well, what's private cloud? Is this just marketing term? And so we look to NIST, which is the National Institute of Standard Technologies, for a little bit of help. And any time that we have to look to the U.S. governing body for help, we might have lost our way somewhere along the line. But there's three real key elements here that the people are looking for, and it's governance, measurability, and self-service. And those are the three things that IT is starting to try to provide internally, generally with virtualization as the foundation and the footprint for that. And if you build off the virtualization momentum and the ability for storage to start scaling much more rapidly and tiering itself automatically, then we get to that same cloud-like infrastructure that people have been looking for and, as I said in the beginning, mostly circumventing IT for. And so that's really what we're starting to see the bigger companies take a foothold and starting to place their bets on, is how to marry up the process of having been gone around in many cases, but also build a platform so that they can now be in the driver's seat again.
Makes sense. You raise an interesting question for me. So you talk about software as a service and pulling it in, and you didn't use this term, but IT is more of a broker of technology. But so Margaret, if we think about that, businesses are always looking at what to bring in-house, what to outsource, and that line seems to be changing quite a bit. What do you recommend for the enterprise users? How do they decide what they're going to keep in-house, what they might do in a cloud setting, et cetera? How do they decide?
It's a very interesting question and one that's constantly evolving. And a lot of times it comes down to what a company considers mission critical. But mission critical is also something that's very much in the eyes of the beholder. So I've been working with 2 insurance companies recently. So both do claims processing. It's a core part of their business. One insurance company considers that that's a high volume, repeatable task, and they're very happy to outsource it to a call center. The second insurance company considers it absolutely mission critical, that when someone calls in with a claim in a high-stress environment, that's their moment of engagement, and they want their best and brightest at the front line directly engaging with that customer. So mission critical is something that means different to different people. But if you put that aside, I think what we're seeing is really 2 segments of who's comfortable in the cloud and what they're comfortable putting in the cloud. And I'll divide that into the smaller companies and then larger companies. Small companies who may not have access to the same level of capital or the same level of expertise are very comfortable in putting their end-to-end systems in the cloud, and they're doing it in weeks. We've gone beyond the years of implementation, and they're doing it in weeks. So we have over 1,000 companies globally now running their end-to-end systems in the cloud. They're mission-critical systems and are very comfortable with it. When we look at the larger companies, they are more, as Mark alluded to, in an edge environment. So they're comfortable with travel and expense management, with human capital management, sales force effectiveness, but not so comfortable in putting their key competitive pricing algorithms that makes them different and special in the cloud yet. So what I think what we're going to see evolving is, and very much agree with Mark's point on this, the organizations that can combine the best of cloud with the best of on-premise in a way that's comfortable to deliver to their mission-critical scenario, that's what we're going to see a transition to.
Interesting. And David, you gave an interesting story when we were talking earlier about how businesses can accelerate the delivery of new services that I thought maybe you could share.
For sure. And what we're seeing our customers do is enter into new markets and take on applications that they couldn't do before. And I think what cloud computing, and specifically applications, mostly SaaS and cloud computing could be to computing what the internet was to communications. And so we think this is the next natural step, as Don said, about where the internet is going, and just really putting all the computing resources available to companies out there. And so what we're seeing is companies are implementing new applications, getting into new businesses, and acting very nimble as they do that. And I think the challenge that comes with that is the IT organizations, the traditional IT organizations, are finding themselves often in the position where applications are actually being utilized without their knowledge. And so what we've been working with customers is actually identifying that. And what we're trying not to do, and I think we'd all agree, is trying to squelch that creativity of end users, but to bring some chaos back in and control, because the fact is, if you lose control of your corporate data, it's a big problem. And as I always say to the CIOs I meet with, I'm not sure any CEO is going to say that's okay, because it's a big deal, and more and more importantly, keeping that information in control, whether it's out on some kind of cloud environment or not, is going to be viewed as the CIO's responsibility. So going back to your question, we absolutely see applications. CRM is a great one. The implementation among small companies for CRM has grown by 50% alone in the last 3 years. And that's an example of an application that would not be available or affordable by companies otherwise. And so that's the kind of thing we're seeing, and we're seeing improvements in productivity. In Canada specifically, we've got big issues, and we've got, on average, Canadian companies spend 40% less on software than their American counterparts. And so, we see this as a huge opportunity for Canadian companies to get back up to the level of innovation so that they can compete globally, and that's where we think the cloud opportunity is going to really make a difference.
And Albert, Greater China, Taiwan, that part of the world is incredibly important to us for many aspects, including supply chain. Can you spend just a minute and talk to us about where you see the priorities for investment and where the cloud is going in that region?
Okay. Before I answer these questions, tomorrow we will have 10 to 12, our CCAD dedication. There's a workshop there in room 516C. I hope everyone will be there. and our delegates, yes, we are coming from the Asia, that part of the world, and currently cloud is everywhere. People are talking about it. And however, if you look at our Taiwan industries, we were pretty much number one, like a 94% of PC ODM there, 93% of LCD servers and motherboard is manufacturing there. And include now server is 40% manufacturing there. So if you look at IaaS plus PaaS, like a platform and infrastructures, pretty much the segment is there from Asia. Now in both sides, including mainland China and Taiwan, we have an ECFA agreement. Then it comes to the total, maybe worldwide, all the hardware pretty much in that area. then to move forward, I guess everybody mentioned that service and applications are two big things in the futures. And therefore, a lot of applications people are talking about. In our country, I guess this morning or this afternoon, our deputy ministers talk about all those infrastructures that we had in Taiwan, and that bringing up that the next stage, besides the LTE, the big pipe, because in China, I guess TD-LTE is quite popular and become like one of the standard in the futures. I guess in the U.S., AT&T, Verizon has been adopted. Definitely Qualcomm is a big company in that arena. So all these pipe, we are coming from WiMAX to LTE, maybe 2013. And now NCC, hopefully the spectrum can be well defined. I guess that part still all over the world still trying to find out whether it's a 700 megahertz or 2.5 gigahertz or 3.5 gigahertz. It's all different. However, now in China, people are trying to go into all those smart cities, try to deploy. And at the time now, the pipe will become bigger. That means that you are talking about 50 megabit per second downlink or even more in the wireless arena, so-called mobile cloud. I guess mobile cloud is everybody's thinking. And as an infrastructure like 100 megabits per second, 80% like Deputy Minister promised, Taiwan, you got to have that kind of infrastructures. And 7 megahertz in the cellular handsets. If with infrastructure now, next, let's talk about the applications. In Taiwan, I guess government, we call it G-Cloud. Government cloud, basically. Even I wish can be private cloud more, but starting from G-Cloud. In G-Cloud, our another ministers with our portfolio, he mentioned we have maybe 10, 11 clouds to begin with, like agriculture, culture, education, or health cloud, or even more like food safety, transportation, even policing, and all of the places to set up the camera infrastructure. So all these are benefit to all people in Taiwan. And same as China. They deploy all the smart city everywhere because IoT infrastructures is getting mature. But still, if I wish, the other day, because I live in California, the other day I visited a vineyard, Napa Valley. Hopefully, in the future, if with cloud, we can manufacturing the wine, maybe in Taiwan or China, and use cloud from $20, maybe US dollar a bottle of wine, then we can become $100 or $200 by using cloud technology. I guess that's the down-to-earth so-called cloud application that we need in our daily life. I guess all us talking about G-Cloud, but I guess the definition of cloud should be in a daily life, change people like education. In most of the Asia, I guess people are not as educated as maybe part of the US or something. And so I guess that's helpful in the mountain area for us. Again, in China, from public cloud to private cloud, now it's a mixed cloud. Then the concept now is like a down-to-earth to carry out the cloud computing right now. Instead of talking about safety, security, I guess that's not a showstoppers for the applications. So again, we are looking forward for the cloud computing in our area. And also, we can bring out all our infrastructures or hardware to be even more mature to deploy everywhere. People, if you have applications or services, then can plug and play. So the dedicates, we have ECFA. We have a lot of vendors coming along and carry hardware and brought up some application in our area. And with E3, they did Cloud OS of more like infrastructure side, and maybe cloud appliances for enterprise, especially small business. They need it instead of big company. So all these we are focusing on. Hopefully, that can communicate with the world.
Thank you, Albert. You touched on a lot of topics for me. We've talked a lot about sort of traditional businesses, and we've entitled this section The Business Benefits of the Cloud, but I think that's a narrow and unfair definition. Amit, would you talk about where you see the benefits of the cloud for research, for healthcare, for the kinds of spaces you deal with?
Sure. Mark described the cloud as a game changer. Indeed, it is a game changer. Another way of looking at it is the impact it is having on how we behave. And I'll give you several examples where I certainly can draw a conclusion that it is also an agent that's changing our behavior. So start with, perhaps not a very fitting example, but in my mind it is also a small example of a cloud Facebook. So when I was growing up, if I wanted to share my album with somebody needed to visit me. So now that is no longer the case. And in a global village, I have family and friends who live all across the globe, right? So, when you post some pictures, you can share them literally instantly and get feedback from your friends. So that's one example. So let me elevate that example to how our students learn. You have heard about the millennials. They are actually a very special generation, and we see it in many different ways. And one very positive manifestation of the generation is they work collaboratively. They learn together, right? Of course, there is the danger that there may be some misuse of that process, but by and large, it's a very positive process. So you'll find your children sitting on their desktop, laptop, whatever, tablets, working collaboratively with others, and professors increasingly are sitting, that collaboration with information, lectures, data, and whatnot. Let me elevate to really a very important development in Canada. Earlier, you heard Minister Gary Goodyear and Minister Brad Dougad make reference to IBM's partnership with 7 Ontario universities. I don't think that partnership would have been possible without this cloud environment, and here is why. Well, first, IBM probably would not have seen the need to work with the 7 universities to tap into their resources, because the big blue probably would have felt that neither of these institutions alone had sufficient elements to contribute, but collectively they saw the benefit of significant opportunity there. From institutional point of view, my institution, Western, received a significant gift. So this is a gift in kind in the form of cloud software and those sort of things. We didn't have to hesitate a moment before we accepted that gift with pleasure, because we don't have to worry about where we're going to put that gift. So, go back 30, 40 years, if you received a large computer as a gift, first thing you have to worry about is, where do I put it? How much power do I need? In terms of our institutions, as much as we collaborate, but we also compete with each other, right? So the culture of collaboration and competition, they go hand in hand. But imagine, again, 30, 40 years back, IBM makes available a large computer because physical location is important, notwithstanding the nearly large chunk of money to house it. I bet the 7 institutions would have gone toe-to-toe to try to compete who gets it, right? And the institution that gets it, has that significant advantage. Now, all of a sudden, those constraints are gone. It really doesn't matter where that, computers lie. In fact, you are better off not receiving the capital infrastructure, let somebody else take over, as long as you have access. So it is changing the way we behave, the way we work with each other. And I think only time will tell, but I think, good things will come out of this change in behavior, more collaboration, more working together, for the betterment of humanity. Think of some of the large problems that we deal with. What is clean water, health? I know you'll have a question on health, but in Canada, because of the way we fund our medical system, we probably have the most reliable health data of any other jurisdiction that you can think of. We haven't tapped into that yet, but imagine the opportunity to be able to tap into that population health data, how it may help health research and public policy making.
Thank you. And David, you also have done work with the public sector with specifically health. How are the unique challenges being addressed there?
Well, there's no question the biggest issue from a public sector perspective is sovereignty, the control of the data, and making sure that, from a sovereign nation perspective, that the information is retained within the borders. And I think that, that's a high-level concern that is, from the smallest, the smallest taxpayer all the way up to the most significant and key mandarins making decisions in governments. And I think people are still concerned about where their health records are, where the information about them as a taxpayer is, all of the public, all the private information that ends up being recorded by governments through whether it be municipality all the way up to the federal governments is of key concern. And I think nobody, Don spoke about the Amazon, being down a few minutes ago, and can you imagine, the politicians' reaction to, medical records are suddenly available and been pilfered on the internet? And we know that the risks are high, and so I think there's just going to take some more time. I think it's going to take some more socialization of these issues, and I think that, it will eventually come on, because I think the point that's been made is absolutely accurate. In Canada, we have the opportunity, like nobody else, to take the power of an electronic medical record and reduce the cost of our overall medical system. And I think we have a responsibility to do that so that we can offer more health care to more people in a more effective way. But I think you just have to read a little bit anywhere on the internet to realize the risks. And I think some of you may have seen the article yesterday on the web about the problems. They think there's a risk that defibrillators could be hacked into and damaged, or insulin providing units that patients wear around. And so, that to me really shows the kind of risk, which is far greater than whether your record gets exposed to somebody. I'm not sure anybody wants to see my medical record, and who cares? But the reality is that there is risks, and they're probably much more profound for things like, people who get malicious. And I think that it'll take time for us as a society to get used to it. We all know that the truth is our information is all over the place. And whether you're processing a credit card transaction or you're filling an insurance application that's going back to the insurance company, the information is fluid and it's everywhere. And I think as we as consumers and taxpayers realize there isn't as much risk as we think there is, I think we'll see a higher adoption of cloud technology by governments. And I, again, go back to there's no better place for productivity to be offered than through public service and down to medical care, and the information available, the power, the computing facilities to look at x-rays and move those images around the world. The opportunities are significant.
Thanks. And that raises another question for me. You've all talked about the blurring of lines, and there are a lot of corporations now looking at bring your own device and those kind of things. Margaret, if you take a look at how this is going, how does the cloud accelerate that process, or does it, I guess?
I think they're very linked. You talked about millennials and who've grown up with huge access to huge amounts of information, and much of it they've accessed in the cloud. So as we look forward to 2016, where over 50% of the workforce will be made up of millennials, it's a reality. They're used to using their own devices. They want to bring their own device to work. They've grown up with the cloud, and so that's what we absolutely must support. So if I even look internally at SAP, where on a global basis, we're supporting 19,000 iPads and 17,000 BlackBerries and 10,000 iPhones, it's very much a world of bring your own device. What matters most is what's the security that you can bring, that yes, my world of personal and professional is on one device, but what's the power within SAP, controlled by SAP software, to control that device should I walk across the street and join the competition? So I think when you match those two worlds, then you very much have bring your own device is very much a reality. And then the cloud extends that, because one of the major communication providers, for example, in Canada, Rogers, is actually offering the SAP cloud software for managing mobile devices and now making it available to any corporation, any one of their customers in Canada, so they can also offer bring your own device in a secure environment. So very much linked and accelerating that whole move to bring any device to work and expect your employer to hook it up.
You know, this all sounds really good, but in the opening remarks, I talked about maybe some of the potential downsides. Mark, you know, an article's been written about how these mega data centers may or may not be environmentally friendly, et cetera. And so that brings us back to the question of how public policymakers and private ventures need to work together to make this a reality. What would you say?
Oh, sure. Hang the negative side of cloud on me. That's fine. No. That's right. Well, it's an interesting challenge to think about. I think, first of all, we have to kind of recognize that every server inside of one of these cloud data centers is generally not a net new. And what I mean by that is it was probably going to go somewhere else if it didn't go there. We're increasing the need for capacity for compute power daily, and a lot of the compute power is being consumed on the cloud, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it wouldn't have been put somewhere else inside of a different data center. So I think we have to look at these in an interesting manner. There's an opportunity here actually to become more green and to actually make this a little bit better, because we know that certain parts of the world are going to produce energy in a renewable fashion and are going to do it in a much cleaner fashion. And I think the responsibility and the opportunity is to try to take advantage of that. For example, we've opened a data center in Quincy, Washington, because of the fact that it's hydro, and there's a lot of green renewable energy there. And we're not alone. We're seeing a lot of people start to open data centers there. So there's an interesting opportunity to take something that might have had to been coal-powered or maybe dirty powered somewhere else, and put it with a more renewable energy infrastructure. So there's some opportunities to do things better. The other interesting thing is it's not always, we're finding that some of the parts of the world that might not have naturally been selected as a good place for data centers is actually fantastic. One example of that is we've been customizing servers for a lot of the world's largest data centers for a long time. And with that, we generally do things like forego redundant power supplies for higher density, or to be able to put more chips into, more CPUs and memory into smaller spaces. And if you accelerate where that whole industry has gone, you've come up with this idea of containers. And everybody thinks of rail car containers because that's how these are shipped. But it doesn't have to be just a rail car container. It can be containers of almost any size. But we had the world record PUE, which is really just short for power efficiency, was actually in the middle of a desert in the United States. It was on the roof of a data center because we used natural cooling. There was no coolant provided. It was just natural cooling to cool this. It turns out the low humidity was humidity is actually more harmful, as you probably know very well, Mike, than the actual temperature. And some of these discoveries were, inadvertent, quite honestly. I think we found out through lots of time. I mean, our military, the U.S. military, actually took a lot of servers over to the desert and did a lot of field testing that we probably would have never thought of doing to them. And we learned quite a bit, which is our servers generally can run a lot warmer, and with lower humidity, then there's a lot of opportunity just to use air cooling. So I think that, but that wouldn't have been a natural occurrence if it was just inside a small data center. So if you took that same amount of compute power and spread it across hundreds of companies, it wouldn't have made sense, business or economics, or environmental sense, to try to run those outdoors. So there's opportunities as we look at this the internet moving to cloud computing, to change the way we do it. So, it can be certainly viewed as a negative, and I would agree there are some challenges ahead of us, but it's also an opportunity.
Thanks. And David, we talked about the addressable market a little while ago, and specifically about the fact that small businesses and so forth will have access to technology they never did before. But that's going to open up a lot of interesting sort of regulatory questions as well, and I can imagine people jumping in to fill that void who might have their own ideas about how to do that. So from your perspective, from a public policy point of view, how do you see all that playing out, and what do we need to do to work through this and make sure it happens in the correct way?
Well, yeah, let me just first of all bring out a couple of key points about this, and that is that if you look at the amount of money spent by companies per employee for an information technology perspective, you can find that the bigger the company, the significantly higher spend per employee. And again, no surprise, if you go to a big bank or a larger corporation, they implement lots of technology to make their people more productive. And a small company, 4 or 5, 10 employees, would think a mail server is something great, and have a web page, and Bob's your uncle, right? So the opportunity really is for those smaller companies, and we think that there's a huge game changer here, and that's because we think that companies that used to spend maybe a fifth of what a larger company would spend could spend 5 times as much per employee on information technology, software, communications, technology, et cetera. We think they can leapfrog where they've been before, much like cell phones are allowing the poorer countries, the third world, to leapfrog the wired communications environment they had. And we think that can allow companies to become significantly more productive. And so we think the addressable market, we know this business is trillions today on a global basis, and we think that this could go up by a factor of 2 or 3 through the implementation of cloud technology. And primarily I think about infrastructure as a service and applications as a service. And so we think the opportunities are huge, and we think that this will become like a snowball rolling down the hill over the next 5 years. We know that this industry will grow at 5x the traditional growth of the IT industry. If you say it's growing at 6 or 7%, generally people would say the IT industry grows at twice the rate of GDP, and we all know that's not high enough today. But this industry will grow cloud computing and services at the rate of 5x. And Mark mentioned the whole issue around data integration, which will become the big one, because as people put in multiple SaaS apps, then they'll be required to pull the data together to create an enterprise kind of information environment. And I think that there'll be a lot of services that will spin off that. But to go back to the regulatory requirements, we think that there'll be the opportunities will be there, and we think governments will react. And the big issues are around pipes, because clearly this all depends upon large pipes. And when you talk about the kinds of infrastructure investments that we see being made in Asia, that's what needs to be done. For those of you who saw the ministers speak from the countries that were up here on the panel before, you saw some countries had, the number of phones was mobile phones, 124% penetration in one of the countries, and then the other ones are down at 15 to 30%. And I think that's where governments are going to play a role to make sure that the technology of communications is there, whether it be LTE or large pipes. This is really critical for us, and I think the opportunities are big. But I think from an industry's perspective, everybody sitting up here, this is exciting, because this market is going to make this industry much bigger than ever before, and I think will create productivity for companies that never before was possible, and I think will increase the welfare of the planet.
Thanks. It's interesting from my point of view, being a CIO, I have to worry about sometimes where my data is, and the cloud is kind of an interesting two-edged sword in that regard. But Margaret, as a big provider of software around the globe, a lot of this case law, a lot of these policies are still being written. Where do you see that going, and what do you see governments already doing?
We're seeing an increasing openness to put more and more data to the cloud. So one of my favorite examples is the federal government of the U.S. Today, they have issued a cloud-first policy, which maybe not everybody thought they might do that. But for all new acquisitions for the federal U.S. government, they will first look at the cloud. So that's a pretty major statement, and one that we're seeing more and more companies examine first and think, is that the right thing for them? So if you look at the U.S. federal government, already today, they're clearly a big user of SAP software, both on-premise and in the cloud, and 1 million users in the federal government in the U.S. access their human capital management application in the SAP SuccessFactors cloud today. So that's one we've seen great movement from. The U.S. government has also adopted the cloud in delivering to the citizens. So as you look at the recovery from the recession and the use of funds and the TARP funds, if you go to www.recovery.gov, that's a cloud-based solution hosted by a telecom provider powered by SAP software to give all citizens access to where is their tax money being spent in the recovery. So constant more and more openness to examine where does the cloud fit, and a cloud-first policy that's coming out from some of the leading governments.
That's really good, and personally, I like to see where my money's going, so that's a good thing. But Amit, not everybody feels the same way, right? Institutions, research institutions, are more and more doing healthcare research and other research that does have privacy or security implications. Talk about this from that perspective, if you would.
Thank you. It's a very important question. In the past, we didn't really pay perhaps as much attention to some of the safety issues because, one assumes that most of the things that we do in our world, kind of are okay. We publish most of the stuff that we work on. So the notion of security, protecting information, is perhaps not as robust in academic institutions as it is elsewhere. But there are exceptions. When we look at healthcare research, clinical research, we cannot do research without access to healthcare data, and yet, we need to protect them. And in a collaborative environment where we would like more universities, hospitals, and others to work together in solving some of these vexing problems, where collaboration is a must, maintaining safety and security of the data becomes extremely important. Well, we can apply some of the existing solutions with respect to security, all those industry standards. I think what is required is more fundamental than that. I think what is required is really further research and development into encryption type of, and other similar type of activities, which will make many of these transactions and data is really safe for us to use. And I remain hopeful because it is possible for us to evolve in that direction. In the meantime, of course, we need to be mindful of those safety issues and protect the data.
And it's really interesting because I know a lot of academia depends on collaboration and social networking and those kind of things. And I have to admit, I really struggle sometimes with why Facebook is interesting. But if you think about but if you think about the rise of social networking among people, Margaret, what do you think in terms of social networking among businesses? Do you see that as having a place in the future?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's the great equalizer in terms of letting any business evolve and then businesses communicating with each other to drive efficiency, for example, in their supply chain. So when you look at the whole SAP acquisition of Ariba and us combining and networking the supplier chains together from 750,000 suppliers globally, and then powering that within memory technology at lightning speed, then the adoption across businesses and the potential for collaboration is phenomenal.
Thanks. It looks like we have a couple of questions from Twitter that none of us knew were coming in, but let me see among us if we can tackle one of these at least. Interesting question for me. Which countries are doing open government well? Not sure. Okay. Let me try the other one. And Albert, this one might be best addressed to you. What do you feel the infrastructure, IP, packets, optical, that underpins the cloud, what does that need to deliver in order to deliver future value? Let me send that down there, actually.
Okay, this is very technical.
Yeah, that's why I didn't answer it.
Okay, I guess from ICE perspective, if you look at those operators from telecommunication area, they are going to building data centers. That means that from original gateway, and now it changed to be only ICE infrastructures. So maybe some telecommunication industry they will think about it. How about combine infrastructures into traditional base station? So these two combined, maybe, I guess, again, backbone is combination of everything. It has wireless, and fiber optics, or even satellite. So there are multiple interfaces need to be in place in the futures. And for example, back to, I guess, 1996, when I was doing a so-called satellite phone with a US company. And interesting, you can imagine who needs satellite phone. It's quite expensive, right? And then you begin to think of, in Asia, there are 3 countries. They put out $600 million to build up a geostation satellite phone. And because they cannot put their base station in the water, means ocean. So for Malaysia, Thailand, those areas, they want to have satellite phone. I mean, infrastructure is different with most of the world. Therefore, in these days, for eyes, that perspective, it will combine, I believe, in the future, either through satellite or through fiber optics, or operators through typically infrastructures, or people say Wi-Fi, getting popular, so access point. So in LTE, people talk about these, how to mix up with all these technology all together to build a smart base station or smart gateway in the future. So that's I can envision in the future.
Thank you. Yes.
I didn't answer that because of that adjective, open government. But if I narrow it down a little bit, use of IP, adoption of IP, I'm not in a position to rank, but I'm very impressed with what Australia is doing. As Canadians, we need visa to go to Australia. You just go online, print your stuff. Within a minute, you get your visa, and you show up at the airport. You don't have to show the printed copy. They have it.
Thanks. And we're about out of time here, so I really would like to thank all of you for coming and doing this. I don't know about the audience, but I've certainly learned a lot. We've covered a lot of ground on a lot of different topics. We've talked about technology. We talked about a lot of the lines being blurred. We talked about public policy and many different things. I think it's in all of our best interest as we move this topic forward to focus on how we can accelerate the process and how we can foster as much open competition as possible. And, frankly, if I were answering the question about the governments, that's one of the things I would ask for, is that, we think really hard about how we can make competition more active and more of a level playing field, just like the cloud is making for our businesses. Because when we do that, costs are going to come down, the technology will accelerate, and all of us will be better off. So, again, thank you, all of you, for your answers and for your time.